Thank you, President Gertler, for framing our discussion for the next couple of days, themes I know that we're going to unpack over the course of the symposium. Now it's time for our first roundtable discussion, focused on innovative and inclusive public-private partnerships to reach the hardest to reach, a chance to listen in on a conversation among 4 special guests. As a quick reminder, please submit your questions at any time in this discussion through the chat, and we will be bringing these to the guests following the discussion. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the roundtable guests. We're joined here today by CEO of Windmill Microlending, Claudia Hepburn, CEO of Shared Value Initiative Hong Kong, Virginia Wilson, Associate at Boston Consulting Group and a REACH alumni, Hui Wen Zheng, Director General, Innovative and Climate Finance Bureau at Global Affairs Canada, Sue Szabo. Claudia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Maren, and thank you to everybody at the REACH Alliance, the Monk School, and the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for hosting this wonderful couple of days of conversation and hopefully impact. I'm delighted to be joined here by by 3 amazing women leaders who are doing so much in this space. So I'd just like to welcome all of them and really look forward to this discussion, that it really is across sector, across partnerships, and from around the world, with Virginia joining us from Hong Kong. So perhaps just as we get started, I'd love to get each of the 3 of you to say something about your work and your area of focus, the project you're working on, and your desired goals for this. So just so the audience can all have a sense of where we're coming from and what our passions are. Virginia, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I am the Chief Executive of the Shared Value Initiative in Hong Kong, and really I came in contact with Shared Value Initiative about 6 years ago when Michael Porter was in Hong Kong. I have been working in the private sector and the public sector for many years prior. And when I understood really what shared value really brings to the table, I thought I have to it falls into place with just all my beliefs, all my philosophical understandings, and how really it is the future that we all want to envision. And maybe later on I'll be able to tell a little bit about examples when we get further into the discussion about what shared value is about.
Great, thank you. Hui Wen.
Everyone, and great to hear about your experiences, Claudia. I guess I can speak a little bit about my REACH case study as it relates to public-private partnerships. So my REACH case study this past year focused on good practices and public-private partnerships, specifically in global health, and focused on a case study in vaccine delivery. But prior to working in the private sector now, I primarily worked in the social impact space across both the private, the public, and actually also the nonprofit sectors. And of course, now my work focuses on working with organizations across all sectors to tackle kind of their challenges and unlock their opportunities.
And you've been working on a fascinating study around vaccination in Mozambique, so we'll look forward to hearing about that. Sue.
Thanks. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. It's really great to be part of the symposium. And first, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. My work in climate and innovative finance really means that we're working on programming these resources that Canada has put aside to really try to change the needle in terms of where the world is going in implementing the Paris Agreement. Canada has put aside $5.3 billion over the next 5 years in climate finance for developing countries. And we're also trying to be innovative in how we're working. So another pot of money that is under my reign is $1.6 billion in innovative finance. So really, we're kind of more users of research and best practice, but we also aim to test out ideas. How are we actually making sure that this funding is reaching the poorest and the most vulnerable? How do we test out ideas? And I'm really glad that we'll get a chance to speak about some of that today. On a personal note, I'll just add that my interest in how to use the financial system to achieve public policy goals really goes way back to my PhD in the early 90s on women and microfinance. And so I hope that during today's session, I might also inspire some of you to think of the public service as a career option.
Fantastic. So I love this fact that the four of us come from different sectors and are looking at this work in public-private partnerships in such different ways. Virginia with a background in the private sector, Hui Wen in the private sector but focused on research and in academia, and Sue, you coming from a perspective of putting government funds to work with a background in research and working in the developing world in health. And so I'm come from the non-for-profit sector. I've spent my life building mission-based organizations in the charitable sector that look at innovative ideas that have the potential to really transform and make a big impact on raising human capital. And Windmill, we do that through making loans and affordable supports to immigrants and refugees who come here and are stuck in poverty because they don't have access to affordable credit and are prevented from working in their field here where they trained and have experience and have brought all that to Canada as a result of the need for accreditation and licensing, or just some basic biases that people have against hiring people that come from academic institutions and companies in other parts of the world that they're not as familiar with. So I'm super interested in this conversation and the ways that government and private sector can work with the nonprofit sector and academia to prove out great models like this. So we all know the human tendency is to work in silos, and yet we have a need to collaborate across sectors. We need government, academia, corporate leaders, and nonprofit leaders to communicate and collaborate better. So I'd love to ask each one of you to give us an example of some successful cross-sectoral collaboration and the impact it's had that you've seen it having on the lives of the last mile populations that you're serving. Sue, perhaps we can start with you.
Great, thank you. So I've noted that, we're working in the finance sphere. We have a lot of climate finance and innovative finance that we seek to deploy. So in the financing sphere, in terms of public-private partnerships, we're really speaking about blended finance. So the idea that we can take some more concessional public money, put it together with private sector money, and really try to achieve things in our projects that allow the private sector to go beyond what I'd call business as usual. And particularly in the climate sphere, that means trying to go towards low carbon pathways, renewables, low emission buildings, climate smart agriculture. But one of the ways in which we try to take this the step beyond, and perhaps some of you have heard about the term just transition in the climate sphere, which is essentially saying that it's not just about the technical aspects of weaning the world off coal and off fossil fuels, but it's also about the jobs, the workers, the communities who need to be included in this transition. Canada, in fact, has been working in this area for a long time. And in our world, we look at this issue of just transition through the lens of our feminist international assistance policy, which has always had us look at gender equality and how to work with the most vulnerable. So I'm going to speak just a little bit about some of the work we've done with larger private sector entities, larger companies where we're trying to get them to work in the renewable sector, but again, not as business as usual. And some of the things we've done include putting in performance-based incentives. So you'll get the finance, but you will get a discount on that interest rate in the finance if you can also implement goals related to gender equality. And some of the things we've been able to do, for example, is get internships for women in STEM areas. And these are traditionally sectors where women don't get involved. So trying to get them these opportunities that the low carbon economy is going to have. Also trying to get women on boards in these companies because we know that when boards have more women, they generally make better decisions in the climate space. So these are some ways in which we're trying to actually use our finance to create these incentives to create more jobs, job opportunities, as well as the representation. But we know that, we've got a lot of great examples. We've been doing this work for about 5 years. And what we've just done is launched a study that is going to try to look across all of our examples of gender equality projects that are using this blended finance approach with the private sector to look at what worked, what didn't work so well, and how we can try to make these results replicable or scalable.
That's fascinating. We should talk about some of these things because here at Windmill, we're doing some of the same kinds of exploratory work in figuring out how to bring together private sector and government and foundations and philanthropists who all are looking to create the same goals. And some of them want to invest, some of them want to donate, some of them care about financial returns, other than just care about social impact returns. And I think there's so much rich opportunity right now with interest in these goals to do more of these things. And I think in the next 5-10 years, with organizations, with the work that you're doing internationally and the work that a lot of people are doing here in Canada, we're going to see some great learnings and outcomes. So it's exciting. Hui Wen, tell us about your work.
Yeah, I think for this, I will speak to our REACH case study on the Mvaccination pilot in Mozambique, which was essentially a cross-sectoral partnership between Mezzanine, which is Modafone's South Africa subsidiary, USAID, Gavi, GSK, Village Reach, and also Mozambique's own Ministry of Health. And essentially, this initiative had a mobile phone application, which can be used by frontline healthcare workers to record the number of vaccinations given to newborns and also send push notifications to parents to encourage follow-up doses. And then on the flip side, also enabled healthcare providers to track the stock and inventory levels of their vaccinations in order to optimize deliveries and prevent stockouts in the future. And the program really began in Mozambique's Nampula province in 2014 and was used primarily at this time to deliver DTP combined vaccinations to roughly 95,000 patients. And in the end, they actually delivered over 300,000 vaccine doses. However, I will note that the program actually ended in the province in 2018 without being scaled up, largely due to a lack of buy-in from all partners. But I still think it's quite an interesting example of a cross-sectoral partnership and an innovation which really emerged kind of from the private sector, because as we learn more about the origins of this partnership through our REACH case study, we saw that it was really an effort that was driven from private sector innovation by people who weren't necessarily being paid or were in a specific department to further social impact goals, but were really just passionate and had the skills and the know-how to offer and went about forging this partnership on their own. And of course, this had implications for partnerships because one of the good practices that we found through our research was that you need to understand the problem well and set up partnerships in a very structured and clear way. But nonetheless, I think this had a really positive impact in terms of the numbers of vaccinations that were given out. And I'm sure, as we'll get into later, was used eventually to tackle COVID-19 vaccinations across the entire African Union.
Fantastic. What a terrific outcome. So if you were in charge of designing a new study, a new program, vaccination program, based on what you learned from that, what would you do differently?
Yeah, I think one of the main things we really noted through our research was the importance of setting up the partnership in an intentional way. So much of what contributes to a partnership success is finding the right partners to begin with, making sure that you're all aligned. Of course, each sector, each industry has their own driving incentives. And when you can come together with the right partners at the right time, when all your incentives are aligned, that's going to bring really positive results. So that's definitely a big part of it. I think the other part is having a very clear understanding of what the issue is and what the community really needs. Something we heard from people we had spoken to through our research was the need to conceptualize the public and the community in that public part of the public-private partnership. And so making sure that you're going out into the community and engaging those people first and foremost, as well as including, your public sector partners, your private sector partners, and nonprofit partners, funding partners as needed, is really critical to making sure that you have a successful outcome.
Such an important and basic lesson, isn't it? Talk to the people that you're actually trying to impact. Makes a huge difference. Virginia, can you?
Yes, I think I'm going to come from a different angle, which is not necessarily my current work, but my previous work, which is in the NGO sector. delivering programs, early childhood programs in Vietnam and in Mongolia, and building those public-private partnerships with government, with the local government as well as the federal government, but also listening to really the people who were most in need. And I think that the Mongolia experience has really changed me forever, because they have, in Mongolia, they have something called the youre districts, and really it's like the slum districts in many countries, right? But they have no electricity, no water, no hygiene, because the city of Ulaanbaatar was really built with about 750,000 people in mind. But what happened during the climate, global warming, is that the dzuts, they called it the dzuts, is that overnight the land would freeze and the herds would die. And so people basically lost their entire ability to survive overnight. And so they slowly migrated to the city over the past 10 years. And they started building out a youre district, the slum districts that had no water, they had some electricity that could power a television or maybe charge a phone, but not enough to really warm the youres that they lived in, which they burned coal inside. So you have kids who were breathing this air, and understanding and going and really working with the people and understanding what their needs were, building the programs from scratch, and then getting the companies to help pay for it, getting the government to buy in. Those were really, really hard conversations. And what I found was that even though we were all speaking different languages, and when I say not just between English and Mongolian, but what I mean is sectorial languages, academic languages, languages that really needed bridging because of vocabulary in whatever dialect you might be speaking in. So when you look at the partnerships, it wasn't just building and understanding the people, but it was actually also bridging that gap. And I find that bridging the gap was really one of the biggest learnings that I had in working in that community and learning to speak all of the languages. And with the experience that I had from my previous work, I think that was what was the most valuable piece that I brought to the table. So it was an amazing experience, and some of it was also funded by other governments, actually, like the Canadian government that funded the project that I worked on in Vietnam. So it's really, the partnerships are so important, but so is actually understanding, and understanding each other was really the hardest part when you want to bring partnerships really fruitful to the table.
That's what a poignant example that is. And can you give advice for other people that are setting out in situations where they're going to face similar challenges of multiple languages that they're trying to deal with? How do you go about trying to bridge that divide and learn to speak those languages when you're actually needing to learn them in real time as you're trying to deal with the problems? It's not like you can take 6 weeks out to go and learn languages.
Well, I think actually learn culture. Listen and learn culture. Be observant. Because when you look at the people around you and you're able to observe, you can pick up the nuances, the body language. It doesn't necessarily, you don't have to speak it, but sometimes you can feel it. And having that somatic feeling is so important, just as important as knowing how to speak the language. Oftentimes, I would use hand gestures and different things like that to get my point across. And that also shows the authenticity of wanting to really bring things together. And so it's really the listening, but of the observation and understanding the cultural divides. I think that brings people together more than anything else.
Absolutely. That skill of empathetic listening is so actually more important in many cases, isn't it, than knowing how to speak. It's knowing how to listen and respond empathetically and with your whole body. What a great lesson. The Windmill here in Canada, one of the great collaborations that we're just actually embarking on, was initiated by another nonprofit, actually an American charity that was started by two individuals. And I love this story because it really embodies the power of the individual to identify a problem and start the ball rolling to solve it. And obviously, solving any problem is going to take many thousands of individuals, but the power of any one person to identify a problem and think of a potential solution. And that was a couple who founded an organization called Talent Beyond Boundaries. And the problem that they identified was that there's so many millions of people in refugee camps that are stuck over the long term. And many of those refugees, many of them are unskilled, but many of them are skilled. And that while those skilled refugees are having their skills wasting away in refugee camps, in countries like Canada, Australia, the UK, and the United States, there are skills shortages for exactly those skills. So wouldn't it be wonderful if they could create a database of those skills and connect employers with skilled refugees, and then get governments to create pathways to allow those refugees to come in to the countries and take advantage of the skilled economic visas. And so that's a model that has been being piloted right now with the Government of Canada. It's called the Economic Mobilities Pathways Program, and Windmill is happy to be involved as a lender, because if any immigrant comes in on an economic visa, they normally need to be able to show proof of funding that they can feed their family if they lose their job. And if you've been in a refugee camp for a number of years, chances are you don't have that proof of funding to be able to show. So Windmill is providing affordable loans to those refugees when they're coming to Canada and accepting the jobs, to be able to have a safety net should something go wrong. So we're very excited to be working with employers, NGOs, and the government on that pilot, and look forward to staying tuned. But the lessons that all of you have provided around listening, speaking the language, thinking about the right partners from the beginning, and figuring, not assuming from the beginning that you know exactly what the model is going to look like, but that you're open to learning, the way Sue was saying. So that was a long time we spent on the first question, but I think it was we got into some really great meaty answers from all of you, and I so appreciate that. I'd like to move on a little bit here, and just before I do, I'd like to remind the audience that we are going to be taking Q&A. So if anybody would like to send in their questions, please do, because we will get to those in a few minutes when we're done with the formal questions here. It's always fun to be able to answer the questions that are really on everybody's mind who's tuning in. But we seem to be living in an age of repeated global shocks, as the university president, Mark Gertler, mentioned, with the pandemic, extreme climate events, and war, to name just three of the most obvious. But I'd like to ask my panelists here, have you seen ways that these global shocks have provided an opportunity or an impetus to create new and more successful collaborations? Virginia, perhaps we can start with you this time.
Sure. The global shocks is, I want to say that COVID has shown us all of the cracks in our systems, in the way that our systems were built. They were built to support, how we functioned 50 years ago. They weren't built to support how we function now. And those systems need to change. And, it's been so apparent in so many countries for so many reasons how the elderly, if you, in Hong Kong especially, if you didn't, were not vaccinated, and the government did not do a very good job with trying to get people vaccinated. And when the fifth wave came, our death tolls were very high. And it has exposed, and many of these things have been happening all over the world with systems across the globe. And so I think that our ecosystem needs to change in a really big way. We need to be we talk about transparency, but we need to be so much more transparent, and we need to be so much more authentic in really looking at the problems and the solutions to these problems. I spoke about language earlier, but I think it's also about bridging all of the great things that comes out of research, but doesn't necessarily get translated into action. And so one of the things that we do now at Shared Value is that we're translating all of the research, all of the great research, all of the great things that has been shown to work. You know, it gets lost because it gets lost in academia. All of this needs to be translated into action. And when I was approached to do the symposium, I think one of the great things that Reach is doing is translating this into action with the young leadership and everything that it's doing. So when I look at the ecosystem and, you know, how we look at globalization needs to change yet again, and even faster than last time, because if we want to reach those SDG goals, we're going to have to move a little bit faster, and we actually have all of the tools to do it. We just need to be able to action it and not just talk about it.
Great point. Hui Wen, would you add to that?
Yeah, I think around this point of galvanization and turning to action, I really do think that global shocks have this ability to capture our collective attention. And relative to normal times, these issues of resource distribution and justice become top of mind for all folks. And more people, I think, are willing to put their time and energy towards solutions and are more open to collaborating for the right solution there. And I think vaccine manufacturing and distribution during COVID is a great example of that, though, of course, there are still lots and lots of issues with equitable access across the world. But actually, our Reach team saw this galvanization around collaborative solutions play out kind of in real time with our Mvaccination case study, because as I mentioned, although the original pilot in Mozambique failed to gain traction and buy-in and eventually scale from the partners, the experiences the parties had throughout this initial deployment actually enabled them to quickly step up when COVID-19 hit the African continent and actually deploy this mobile solution in partnership with, this time, the African Union to drive vaccination efforts. And now it's been used across 6 different AU countries to support COVID-19 vaccination uptake. And I think this is just such a hopeful example of how even, you know, partnerships that don't appear to be successful initially can bring really critical experience to all the different people involved and provide a really good foundational basis and proof for future iterations. And of course, this opens the door even post, global shock to the continuous use of these solutions. And of course, this digital vaccine management tool. So I think that's, a glimmer of hope amidst all of this.
We absolutely need those, don't we? Sue, could you add to that?
Would love to weigh in here. And in fact, I'd like to start from Virginia's point about how these shocks, particularly the pandemic, have really magnified some of the cracks. And one of those, big cracks in the system that we've seen is finance for small and medium enterprises in the developing world. And there's an estimated US $42 billion financing gap faced by African women. So, and the small and medium enterprise sector is so important because it contributes to economic growth, it contributes to household livelihoods, but it also provides jobs. And so it's absolutely critical. And yet, we see that there's this dearth of financing to SMEs and to women in particular. So one of the initiatives that we've been supporting is a homegrown African initiative, the Affirmative Financial Action for Women in Africa initiative, which is trying to help financial institutions learn about this clientele and really to put more financing towards these businesses. But the other point I want to emphasize is, it's human nature to always look at the shocks, but particularly in the climate world, we keep saying climate is the biggest slow shock that we're all needing to pay attention to, and we cannot forget about that. And so, to tie that into my SME point, we're also concerned that as the world goes low carbon, what about those small and medium enterprises? Can they also pivot to be looking at how they can provide climate-friendly goods and services, and in that way stay as this important source of livelihoods and economic growth throughout the developing world? And so we're looking at how can we actually try to strengthen the ecosystem for women entrepreneurs in climate-related SMEs, and value chains so that they can start and grow their climate-related businesses in this case, we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa. And Claudia, this goes back a little bit to your skills point, because we know that the skills are there. We know that we have the mechanisms to help enhance those and turn them in the direction of low carbon pathways. But we also need to provide some of that support to make that transition, not just for what we might be funding, but really to develop an international kind of pathway that others might also be able to support.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. So building on this idea that, you know, we're seeing this renewed commitment to making the world a more just and equitable place in a lot of places, not everywhere, not as much as we need, but at least we're seeing a little bit of progress. What role do you see for the next generation of leaders to play in advancing partnerships across sectors? And are there roles, and what are the roles for last mile populations themselves to play in this? Hui Wen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think this really goes back to, you know, centering the role of the public and the local communities and the last mile populations in which we're designing solutions around. So I think, you know, that is really the biggest role to emphasize throughout all of this. But I think it's also on the leaders who, you know, have the financial means, the power, and the resources to listen and to really, you know, keep an open mind, and to make sure that they're, you know, keeping humble throughout the entire process as well, and understanding, you know, who they're in service to. So I think that's kind of what's primarily on my mind, and also what we've seen in terms of best practices as well in public-private partnerships through our research.
Excellent. Sue?
So I mentioned earlier on this whole element of the just transition, how we are looking at communities, vulnerable people in terms of the transition to low carbon economies. You know, one of the things that we get really excited about are some of our what we might call smaller initiatives. So alongside a very big initiative, in fact, it was a $1 billion initiative to the Climate Investment Fund's Accelerating Coal Transition Initiative, which is going to work globally to get countries off coal. We've also put a small-ish component that is going to focus on women's voice and women's leadership in the coal transition. So again, often women are forgotten in terms of these larger, what are seen often as technical issues. And so we're making a really deliberate effort to try to make sure that women are front and central in the decision-making and in the planning for this. The other thing, if I can just briefly mention, is we're also trying to see how we can work better with national Indigenous organizations. We have a new initiative called Partnering for Climate that was announced in February. And as part of this, we're also going to be trying to support national Indigenous organizations as they support climate change adaptation in the Global South. So how can we make sure that we are supporting the expertise and the tremendous knowledge that our Indigenous peoples have, and also bring that to bear on the challenges that developing countries are facing?
Thank you so much. So Virginia, I'll ask you a different question, and then I'd love to get each person on this panel to answer this question while we still have time, because I know we've got lots of young people in the audience who are looking out in their careers, thinking deeply about how they can make an impact in the sector. And what advice would you each have for these young people who are striving to make an impact in the public and private sector as they look about building their careers?
I think one of the key things when I started off was that I was able to work in the corporate sector, and I really understood the language of the corporate sector. And then I moved to the NGO sector, and I was understand the language of the NGO sector. I was able to work with government a lot during that period. So when I was doing this over so many years, I think that you can actually do all of this in a much faster and shorter period of time. if you were to intern in each and every one of these sectors, you will actually be able to see the vast differences that comes to light, and you will be enlightened by understanding and seeing how they work. If you want to speed up your progress of understanding, and really that experience will change how you behave, how your mindset will shift. And that is actually the journey that you want to begin and start, because that mindset shift is actually core to young leaders, to me, for the future. And I would say that if there was one piece of advice, then I would say try all three, or at least all three. There's actually more than three, right? But at least three to really get grounded in that area.
Great advice. Hui Wen.
Yeah, I was going to say that is very reaffirming to hear what Virginia said, because I actually did intern in the nonprofit, public, and private sectors in my undergrad years, and I found it was immensely helpful to opening my eyes up to how the different sectors speak and think, but also really instilled in me a very profound appreciation of where each sector was coming from and the different skills and priorities that they had in mind. And so now I think coming out of that, I really do believe in the potential of public-private partnerships and collaborating across sectors to accelerate progress towards the SDGs. But I guess coming out of those experiences, what kind of made me choose the private sector? And this is kind of more peer-to-peer advice, given that I'm also still figuring it out. But I think it really came from thinking about what skills and what exposure I wanted to build early on in my career, recognizing that careers are long and life is long, and there's lots of opportunities to make impact in all of these sectors now, given that, I think more and more we're galvanizing around, social returns. And so I think being open to the various ways in which you can make an impact is really, really key right now. And I think in my work today, I'm really able to develop my skills at a holistic level and gain exposure to a lot of different situations and industries, while also being able to work on more social impact related projects, both in my work and also in my personal time. And that's definitely something that I want to maximize in the future and make my mainstay. But I think definitely would echo Virginia's points there.
So smart. So smart. I wish I'd had this advice early in my career. And I would just add to that with Hui Wen, that I think you're smart to start in the private sector, because I think you gain a lot of credibility. You gain credibility when you're working in a different sector, when you're speaking. If you leave the private sector and you've built a career there and know how to speak that language, going back to Virginia's early point about learning to speak different languages, it's really, really helpful. Sue.
Great. Okay, so despite my earlier, at the top of the symposium session, consider the public service, I actually really do want to just echo what Virginia said about the mindset shifts and what Hui Wen said about open to ways for impact. Because really, I think the key is to think about what are your goals. It used to be that if you really wanted to work on inclusion or equality or even climate, if you might have thought only of a civil society or public sector kind of role, but that certainly is not the case now. And the need to work across sectors is really great. So I think that the key would be, what are some of the goals that you want to actually pursue? And even if it is in these sorts of areas, then how do you learn to speak the language across the different sectors? And I think being open-minded to this, there's no longer silos really. And how do you bring those silos closer together? I think that is going to be where we're really going to make impact on some of these really wicked problems that are facing the planet.
And how do you do that?
Well, I think there's different ways. I mean, we've, Hui Wen was talking about, working in different sectors and having had the opportunity to do that. That is one option. But I think I go back as well to the active listening point that was made earlier, because, and coming from a public sector, we often think, well, we've got the money, we can finance things, like we'll set the parameters. And that doesn't really work, like especially in the areas that I'm working in. We have to listen to the private sector and the ways in which they speak differently about risk, about opportunity. So it's up to each one of us to think, okay, how do we actually look then at how we can bring those different languages together? Because if we do, we can unlock more opportunities than if we just tried to go about it on our own.
Great point. Great point. It's so true. And I think all of us have felt frustration in our lives when we feel like this other sector is not speaking my language. This other team doesn't share my values. Why are they not getting it? So, but it's incumbent on us always to think, okay, well, you know what? They're probably feeling the same way as I am about this, and let's dial it back and figure out how we can listen better. And I guess from my perspective, the advice that I would share is the thing that has worked for me is always really figuring out what do I like when I take a job, what do I like about it, what fires me up, and what do I find frustrating about it. And when you do go and try different sectors, think about what do I enjoy about this sector, and is this the right sector for me, or is this not the right environment for me? I started life as a teacher, and I found that that working in a unionized environment with people who just sort of threw up their hands and said, I'm sorry, I can't help these young people. We just have to do what we're told, and it's the ministry that decides, or it's the union that decides. I found that incredibly frustrating. So I got into education reform because I wanted to figure out how to run a public education system better. And while that was, pretty bold hubris of a 25-year-old thinking she could figure out how to run a better public education system, having that attitude of what do I really care about and how can I really make a big difference, even if I'm likely to fail because the goal is too big and my powers are too tiny. That to me has resulted in a really interesting and rewarding career, because it's brought me because the kinds of people that you get surrounded by are what you put out there into the world. And if you want to make a big change and work with people with bold ideas, strategic ideas about how to make the world a better place, you're gonna attract that to yourself. And I can tell you it's a ton of fun trying to make the world a better place and work with other values related people who also want to make a difference in ways that you care about. So with that, I think we're right up against the clock, and I want to thank so much all of you for this wonderful discussion. I'm such a big admirer of the work and the work that you're doing, the challenges that you want to solve, and thank you for taking the time to share that with the audience and with Reach. And Maren and the Reach Alliance, thank you so much for the opportunity for us to do this together. Can I turn that back to you, Maren?